So the Allied Trojan horse, as it's come to be known, was actually a manoeuvre where a ship, the River Clyde, was run aground on the 25th of April 1915. It was a collier that could contain 2,000 men, and those men were in the ship when it was run aground, and mainly Irish soldiers, but some British as well. And the idea was that they would come out and surprise people and gain the territory very quickly. Now, that didn't happen. It was an unsuccessful operation. It was eventually terminated because a large number of people died and were wounded in the operation. But there is clearly a connection that's going on between these two wars, and even to the extent where people are trying to sort of do the same move 3 millennia later. So this is a landscape of myth, so many myths and legends. So I'm going to tell you some of them. There's the first one, which is the myth of Helle and Phrixus. Now, Helle is one of the oldest stories about the Dardanelles. The twins, Helle and Phrixus, had to flee from their evil stepmother who was trying to kill them. While they were flying on a golden ram, and this golden ram eventually got turned into the golden fleece that was the object of desire for Jason and his Argonauts. So while they were flying on this golden ram, Helle, the female of the twins, fell into the Dardanelles, and that's where we get the name Cape Helles from. So she's the first myth that we're going to talk about today. Second one is Hero and Leander, and this is a little bit like a Romeo and Juliet story. It's a love story about a couple that was separate but that found a way to be together despite the odds. So each night Leander, who would swim from Abydos, which is on the Asian side of the Dardanelles, he would swim across the Dardanelles to his love, Hero, who lived in Sestos, which is on the European side. Hero every night would light a candle to guide her lover, but one night it blew out and Leander lost his way. He eventually succumbed to strong currents and died. Now, this myth was still very powerful in the 1800s, and in 1810, Lord Byron actually decided he wanted to emulate Leander and decided to do the swim. Now, he failed the first time. It was a bit rough, so he came back and he tried the second time. But it's even possible to do this swim today. So every year, people still swim from the same, from one side of the Straits to the other to emulate Byron and also Leander. So this myth is still sort of almost in practice. The next myth is probably more of history. So we've got Alexander the Great. So we shift from myth to history, and myth is probably it has historical origins in many cases, but is more literary, and history is more sort of inquiry based. So it's well, I guess you could say factual, but obviously there's biases in history. So records instead of stories, perhaps. So Alexander the Great apparently slept with Homer's Iliad under his pillow. And he actually modelled himself on the great warrior Achilles. So when Alexander came to cross the Hellespont, which is another word for the Dardanelles, he sent his army by the most direct route, which was between Sestos and Abydos, which is exactly the route that Leander swam. But he didn't want to do that. He wanted to do something else. So he wanted to go and visit the tomb of Protesilaus. And Protesilaus was the first person to die in the Trojan War. So he wanted to pay his respects at the beginning of a campaign so that so hopefully he could get rid of any bad juju that was going to happen. And so he did that. But it's an example of pilgrimage taking place to this to this peninsula and this part of the world really early on. So Alexander's making a pilgrimage to honour those people who were in the Trojan War. There's a Persian king Xerxes who is actually coming the other way. He's coming from the east into the west rather than Alexander going from the west into east to make his eastern conquests. Xerxes is coming from the east into the west to make western conquests. And he does Alexander's journey in reverse. Now, he has to get an army across the Dardanelles. He tries several different things. He builds some bridges. The current of the Dardanelles is too strong, so they break. He then gets angry with the Dardanelles and decides to whip them, literally with whips, and then brand it with hot irons, which I imagine just makes the hot iron cold. he was meant to be a little bit irrational, Xerxes, but look, we don't know because it was written by someone from Greece, so they probably were a bit biased. But he came up with this great idea where he decided he'd put all of his boats, apparently, 360 I think there were, together, and he lashes them, and you can see the picture here, lashes them together and marches his army across the Dardanelles, which is very clever, really. And so basically he's taming the Dardanelles. It's a metaphor and it's a figurative story about how Xerxes tamed the Dardanelles. So other people that emulated Alexander the Great are the Roman emperors. So Julius Caesar and Augustus, who was his nephew and the first emperor of Rome, they claimed ancestry to Venus through the Trojan prince Aeneas. Now, Aeneas was said to have fled Troy as it burned, and he journeyed through Carthage to Italy, where he founded the ancestors of the Roman people. Now, the journey to Troy, for the emperors who claim their descent from Trojans and from Venus and the gods, allowed them to connect with their cultural heritage. Now this is important because this is what Australians and New Zealanders do when they enter the Gallipoli landscape. So their connections, any connections that Australians are making to Troy and the Trojan War, and any other European story that occurred in the landscape, is an attempt for Australians to really sort of declare their Europeanness. And I really think that the fact that Australia has entered Eurovision now is a really good example of how we align ourselves culturally with Europe despite geographical distance. And the Great War really allowed Australians to participate in something, in a landscape that made them feel at home in Europe and connect Australian culture to Europe. So I just wanted to emphasise that point. This is an example. So this is Ian Hamilton, and Ian Hamilton was the commander of the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. So the people who were at Gallipoli were the Mediterranean Expeditionary Force. So he was their commander, and it demonstrates a strong link between the Great War and the Trojan War. I'm going to read it out. It says, "You will hardly fade away until the sun fades out of the sky and the earth sinks into the universal blackness. For already you have formed part of that creation of the Dardanelles, which began with Hector and Achilles. In another few thousand years, the two stories will have blended into one, and whether when the iron roaring went up to the vault of heaven through the unharvested sky, as Homer tells, it was the spear of Achilles, or whether it was a 100-pound shell from Asiatic Annie, won't make much odds to the Almighty." So here Hamilton's basically taking a quote from Homer and saying, well, what Homer said is pretty much the same as what happened with us, but our weapons were a little bit. So we had shells, you guys had spears, but fundamentally it's the same thing. Now he goes in further with this particular line of inquiry with this quote. So this quote, he says, "A book called the Iliad, containing what we would nowadays call dispatches from the siege of Troy, a campaign almost duplicate to ours, although it took place 3,000 years ago. Instead of a wooden horse, we made use of a steel ship, and that was the River Clyde I told you before. That's about the extent of the difference. Anyone who fought at the Dardanelles in 1915 and reads the Iliad will at once see history repeating itself. In another 1,000 years, the two legends will have blended, and passages from the historians will be expounded in the schools as beautiful images of wicked happenings long ago. For those who died there will never be forgotten." So you can see there's like a real strong connection being made at the time during the war between antiquity and the current war. So that is also exacerbated or, strengthened by the fact that they are actually finding antiquities while they are there. So they are actually doing archaeology on the front lines, particularly the French. Now the French are at Cape Helles. Not all of them are, not all of them are in that particular region, but there were some French at Cape Helles that decided that they needed to excavate a site called Alauas. Now they found a number of things, and they took time off their time at the front line to do it because they felt it was so important. Now Australians too were finding things at Gallipoli and on the front line. So here's a diary entry from Sergeant Lawrence, who was an Australian engineer. He says, "There's nothing exciting to report as to my shift on the tunnels. As we drive through, we come across all sorts of earth, etc. In places we run through great deposits of pottery, rather red and of a very fine texture. It seems to be one of the one class of work. Mostly it takes the form of slabs and seems to be a kind of covering for the dead. I intend to get a little piece if I can." So he's kind of a bit blasé about it, isn't he? He's sort of going, "Oh, I've had heaps of this stuff, it's really old." And one of the places that they're finding most of this stuff is on Lone Pine. So actually, you can actually, if you walk Lone Pine, you see a lot of red clay pottery and brickwork, even just on the surface today, and that's evidence of ancient settlement. So after the war, it was important that things were preserved, bodies were buried, and cemeteries were erected. And so what happens is that the landscape shifts in purpose from being a battlefield to being a memorial park. And the Australian Historical Mission, which occurred in 1919, was basically responsible for making these kinds of things happen. Now, there was also the War Graves Registration Unit, which is now the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, and they actually did most of the landscaping and memorialising work. And but the Australian Historical Mission was the Australian contingent that went over and made sure that everything was in order. Now, they worked with the Turks to survey the area. They came across artefacts. A lot of those have been sent back and exist in memorials today in Australia. So the Australian War Memorial, Shrine of Remembrance. They found earthwork features, so trenches, pits, tunnels, all sorts of different things. Obviously, they found human remains. And the team catalogued their reports, catalogued their findings and reported on what they were discovering while they were there. Importantly, as I said, they worked with the Turkish as well. So Zeki Bey was a Turkish officer who had fought in the Gallipoli campaign, and he accompanied the Australian Historical Mission and offered insight into the Turkish perspective of the campaign. And since 1919, there has been no systematic survey of the Gallipoli battlefields because it is such a sacred, memorialised space. And I'm just going to show a picture of, there's me, I'm the one with the green hat on with sunglasses. This is the Joint Historical and Archaeological Survey of the Gallipoli Peninsula, which was a Department of Veteran Affairs funded team archaeological survey of the Gallipoli Peninsula. And this is the most recent systematic survey and only modern archaeological survey of the Gallipoli Peninsula that's ever occurred. And it was a tri-nation team, so it was a team from Australia, from New Zealand and from Turkey, and we all worked together to record what's left of the battlefield. So this has remained an important place for 3 millennia, more even, and we are still working to make sure that everything is recorded and preserved and catalogued and understood, and this subject will basically take you from antiquity right through to modern archaeological excavation. We don't excavate, actually, modern archaeological surveys of the Gallipoli Peninsula, and commemoration, so memorials and ceremonies and all of the above. So I really hope that you enjoy the subject, and I look forward to working with you over the course of the semester.